What's up guys, welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host Caleb. If you guys want to support the channel, you can click on that whatnot link in the description down below. You'll get a free $15 whenever you sign up, and you'll be supporting the channel whenever you do that. Special shout out to my high contributing patrons. Newsome, you rock. Now let's get into today's Deck Tech with loot, and I have already finished a landfall strategy of this deck. So if you guys want to check that out, I will leave the link right here and in the description. This one's going to be a little bit of a different strategy. We're going to take a more artifact value based approach. Now the main thing with loot is he's so open-ended, you can really build this guy any way you see fit as long as you have a solid density of enchantments, artifacts, and creatures, because we want to make sure we're triggering loot at least once a turn, and we want to be exiling at least 3 cards to make his card advantage worth it, right? Another thing with decks like this, you really want to keep the CMC pretty low. That way we can ensure that we're able to cast the cards that we are exiling with loot. It sucked for some of our key pieces to get stuck there. And then we are playing a little bit of ways to play additional lands, because if you exile 3 lands, you're not going to be able to play them all, but we're going to try to make it to where we can play as many lands as possible, even if we exile 3 of them. But let's get onto the main strategy of this deck. You guys know I love Goblin Engineer loops that just generate a ton of value. The main one I go for is Brass's Tunnel Grinder and Everflowing Chalice. Or Everflowing Well. Sorry, mess that up. But they have added a 3rd card to this insane value engine, and I'm super excited about it. Let me introduce you to Simulacrum Synthesizer. So now whenever we're looping Everflowing Well and Brass's Tunnel Grinder in and out of our graveyard, generating a ton of value, drawing a ton of cards, and getting everything we need to cast, we are also generating a massive board state. And then we're just playing a bunch of artifacts that can copy our Simulacrum Synthesizer, since it's not legendary. That way we can generate even more constructs. So this deck, in short, just generates a ton of value, makes a ton of constructs, and then just gets to the win by smashing face with a construct army. So if that's a deck tech you want to get into, let's get into it. Let's kick it off by going over how to assemble this insane value engine. The easiest way is to get Goblin Engineer. Now, after he enters the battlefield, you have a few options judging on how late it is in the game. Earlier in the game, you're going to grab Sword of Hearthenholm. That way you can keep blinking Goblin Engineer and find all of the pieces you need, such as your Everflowing Well, your Brass's Tunnel Grinder, and then finally your Simulacrum Synthesizer. But in the late game, we're just going to skip all of those steps and grab our Simulacrum Synthesizer so we can start making some massive constructs. I did want to point out, Trophy Mage works very similarly. Now, we can't loop our Brass's Tunnel Grinder and Everflowing Well in and out of the graveyard with our Trophy Mage, but Trophy Mage does essentially do the same thing. We can either grab our Sword of Hearthenholm and blink our Trophy Mage until we get all of our key pieces, or we skip to the end and grab that Simulacrum Synthesizer. It is worth noting we're also on Prized Statue and Ichor Wellspring. These were the kind of 2 you would loop before we had Brass's Tunnel Grinder and Everflowing Well. They're still decent, but they're not as good as they once were. Esoteric Duplicator is going to be very good here. Now whenever we're looping our Brass's Tunnel Grinder and our Everflowing Well in and out of the graveyard, we're going to get another one of the ones that we sacrificed at our end step, just doubling our value and triggering our synthesizer an additional time. Worldwalker Helm is pretty flexible here. The map token, not that great, but this can make token copies of our constructs. Not to mention, there is a couple ways to create a token copy of our Simulacrum Synthesizer, so we can just start doubling up on them, and that's going to be extremely broken. Goblin Welder is a little bit better than Goblin Engineer. Now, while it doesn't have that tutor effect, it can just loop any artifact in and out of the graveyard. So now instead of Brass's Tunnel Grinder and Everflowing Well, we're just going to start looping Mere Battlesphere and Portal to Phyrexia, because that's going to be fair. Saheeli, very good in this deck. This is a solid way to create a token copy of our Simulacrum Synthesizer or any creature on the battlefield. Even getting a token copy of our Brass's Tunnel Grinder gets us insane value while also triggering our Simulacrum Synthesizer. The fact that it triggers on ETB is just absolutely broken here. Master Transmuter kind of does the same thing Goblin Welder does, but it just bounces it back to our hand. So now we're still looping our Portal to Phyrexia and our Mere Battlesphere. It's just going in and out of our hand instead of in and out of the graveyard. Fable of the Mirror Breaker is in here for pretty much one reason. We just want reflections of Kiki Jiki. That way we can create a token copy of our Goblin Welder or Goblin Engineer and get even more ways to loop our artifacts in and out of the graveyard. Cursed Mirror, kind of the same thing here. Not only is it a 3 CMC artifact, but it can come in as our most most valuable piece on the board, whether that be a Goblin Engineer, a Goblin Welder, or even a Terror of the Peaks. Kiyora's Follower, really good here. Not only can this untap our Saheeli, our Goblin Engineers, our Goblin Welders, additionally, it's just solid ramp. We're also playing Mirage Mirror. Not only is this going to be the best thing on our battlefield, probably most likely a Simulacrum Synthesizer or a Terror of the Peaks, but it's just a very flexible thing in this deck. Then we're on Seedborn Muse. You notice there's a ton of tap abilities in this deck, and very few of them, if any, say activate only as a sorcery. So now we're doing the Goblin Engineer shenanigans on all of our opponent's turn as well. I did throw Alchemist Refuge in the deck as well. That way we can kind of just get 3 extra turns if we so happen to set this up with our Seedborn Muse. Reckless Handling is a solid way to get our Simulacrum Synthesizer or anything else we need. We do have a chance to discard it, but that's going to be super fine in this deck when we have so much access to our graveyard. Phyrexian Metamorph just comes in as a copy of our Simulacrum Synthesizer or anything we need it to. Selvala Heart of the Wilds is going to be solid here because those constructs can get very big. Moving on, let's talk about the cards that I consider kind of pseudo loot staples. These cards are specifically in the deck to make sure we're exiling at least 3 cards a turn off of our commander. Wild Growth is just very efficient ramp. Canopy Cover is very efficient protection from our commander. As soon as they catch on to how many cards you are drawing a turn with him, they will try to remove him. Leyline Immersion, it gives it Ward 3, which is very hard to get past. We all know Voja. And then we get to tap Loot for 5 mana. Loot's not attacking, he's just sitting there. So Leyline Immersion is perfect in a deck like this. Exploration is going to help us play additional lands along with Dryad of Illusion Grove. Something cool about Dryad of Illusion Grove, it's an enchantment creature, so it will satisfy 2 of the types we need for loot. Burgeoning, because we're probably not going to be playing lands from our hand as long as we're exiling enough cards. Paradox Haze is honestly one of the best cards in the deck. This is going to make us exile up to 6 cards as long as we have a creature, enchantment, and artifact on the battlefield, which is pretty easy to do in this deck. Sylvan Library is a sleeper here. I know it's just a very generic good card, but it's even better in loot, right? Because let's say we draw 3 cards and they're all trash. We actually don't have to pay the life to keep them. We'll just throw them back on top of the library and loot will exile them next turn, ensuring that we're not exiling any of our key pieces, right? Enthusiast Mechanaut and Ethereum Sculptor, now these are very unique to the strategy of the deck, but they're both artifacts and creatures, and they come down turn 2. So turn 2 we cast these guys, turn 3 we throw loot on the battlefield, and by turn 4 we're exiling 2 to 3 cards from the top of our library as long as we can find an enchantment somewhere in there. Oko is just disgusting in these colors, so along with being a very powerful card, it's going to trigger loot. And then we have Invasion of Ikoria, the best invasion in green. It's also going to allow us to make our constructs kind of pseudo unblockable while triggering loot. Last but not least, we have Delayed Blast Fireball. Now this is going to be very good if we exile it off of loot's trigger, because it's going to be a 3 mana one-sided board wipe that will completely hose over our opponents. Moving on, let's talk about the core of the deck. We have Glinthorn Buccaneer. This might sound like a weird include at first, but Brass's Tunnel Grinder can discard a ton of cards, and we are very consistently bringing that in and out of the graveyard over and over again. We have ways to create token copies of it. We have ways to get additional triggers. We're on Displacer Kitten. It just turns into an insane thing where you draw a good portion of your deck. Now, whenever we can deal damage to our opponents, whenever we discard those cards, that can kill the table very quickly. Portal to Phyrexia and Mirror Battlesphere, along with Displacer Kitten, I don't think it's very hard to see how this can very quickly end the game. We're going to just populate the entire board with our mirrors, and this is just going to make our constructs even bigger, or we're just going to make their lives miserable with blinking Portal to Phyrexia over and over again with Displacer Kitten every time we cast a non-creature spell. We can also loop these with Goblin Welder, but now we have 2 different ways to end the game with these giant pieces. We're also on Wormcoil Engine here. Not that great to blink, but very good if we are just trying to sack it to a Goblin Welder to bring something else back. Anger is going to be a solid include here. It's not hard to get a mountain on the battlefield, and then it's very easy to discard it into our graveyard. So having haste with all of those constructs is very useful, especially when we go off and create a giant board state. It's gonna kind of suck to just pass the turn. Terror of the Peaks can kind of win the game here. We have a couple ways to copy it, and then again, we're just making those massive constructs, or even with Mere Battlesphere, this can do a lot of damage. Rosy Cutthroat Rider is a very good include here. Those junk tokens are going to buff up our constructs, and then if we need to dig deeper, those junk tokens can turn into card advantage that also turn into mana. It's kind of like a mini Jeska's Will. Kodama of the East Tree, this triggers off of ETBs as well. Kind of insane. So now whenever we're blinking our portal to Phyrexia, we can just put whatever we want from our hand onto the battlefield. This even works with our 3-drops whenever we're doing the Goblin Engineer or the Goblin Welder shenanigans. So all of your 3-drops essentially become free as long as we've got our engine online. It can do some crazy things in this deck, and it even counts for lands. So if all we're doing is putting lands into play with this, it's still pretty powerful. Imri, Lurker of the Lock, this mills us a little bit and gives us access to our entire graveyard if we have Encroaching Mycosynth on the battlefield. Encroaching Mycosynth is just going to be very good in this deck, right? We're trying to trigger that Simulacrum Synthesizer as many times as possible, so now that all of our 3-drops are enchant or artifacts, it's just going to help us do that. Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. Now this is just an insane value engine in a teamer list, and then we have a lot of stuff in the graveyard, so I figured it'd be a kind of cool include. Then we're also adding in the fact that we have Mycosynth's Lattice in the deck, so we can turn this into an artifact that triggers our Simulacrum Synthesizer. Maybe that's a little bit of a weird include there, but I think it's going to do some work, and at the end of the day, it's a 6/6 that smashes face, ramps you, gains some life, and gives you some card advantage. Guruk's Uprising and Elemental Bond are no-brainers here. These are going to trigger whenever we trigger our Simulacrum Synthesizer, and then Trample's just going to be very useful with those constructs. Sensei's Divining Top does a couple things in the deck. The first thing it can do is make sure we're not exiling any of our key pieces that are very expensive, such as our Portal to Phyrexia. All we have to do, look at the top 3, put Portal to Phyrexia on top, go ahead and put the top on top, draw Portal to Phyrexia, and then Loot's going to exile the top instead of a 9-drop, right? Very simple there. And then it is going to turn into our opponent's worst nightmare whenever we have Displacer Kitten on the battlefield. Because it's very easy to cast top, then we blink our Brass's Tunnel Grinder, draw a ton of cards, top will enter the battlefield, we'll put the top back on top, and as long as we drew into another thing to cast that's not a creature, we can blink Brass's Tunnel Grinder again, and that's going to put top back into our hand. And this is kind of the scenario where Glinthorn Buccaneer just becomes a flat out win con in the deck. Bottlecat Blast is going to be a very flexible removal spell. Not only are those tapped treasure tokens going to buff up all of our constructs, but this card is essentially ramp. I like Glenalindra Archmage in those strategies that can't exactly cast our counter magic, right? There's no guarantee that we don't exile it with loot off of the top of our library, so counter magic can just seem very bad in these decks if you exile it. This is where I like Glenalindra because you can still cast it and it sits on the battlefield and it's pretty oppressive. That's going to do it for the deck tech, guys. I appreciate you guys sticking around this long. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you did. I also have a third loot deck that's just an instant and sorcery storm list, so make sure to leave a comment if you want to see that. With that being said, I hope this helped you in your deck building endeavors. I would like to shout out my patrons, Newsome, Excessum, Chicken Salad, and Praetor. You guys are awesome. I will see you guys in the next one.